On the 4th of March, the House of Keys will choose 4 people to become members of the Legislative Council. Prior to that vote, Agenda will be speaking with all the candidates so that you can find out more about the people who hope to become national politicians. We hear this week from MLC Rob Mercer, who is hoping to get elected to LegCo for a second term. Perhaps for those who don't know, and there will be some people listening to the programme who don't really know who the members of the Legislative Council are. If you begin just by giving us a bit about who you are, your background, and what you've achieved in the last 5 years, I suppose.
Thank you, Phil. I'm originally from the other Crosby in Merseyside. Moved over here with my family in 1998. So been here a good scutch of time now. I came to work in the finance sector originally, as a number of people did around about that time, I think. Following about 7 or 8 years in the finance sector, I then went off on my own, doing an IT consultancy role, looking after the IT for local businesses on the island. And after that, there was the temptation of the gaming sector, which was undergoing a period of of really great growth at the time. My daughter, by then, was looking to head off to university, so the attraction of a salary was quite strong at that point. And actually, it was a really fascinating and fast-moving industry to work in. A huge amount of challenge and change and work associated with it. So that's the sort of the IT part of the career. I think I did about 8 years at the gaming company, and probably in the last couple of years there, I'd spoken to a number of MHKs on various issues, and actually I think it was Bill Shimmons who sowed the seed. He said, why don't you consider standing for Legislative Council? I'm sure it was Bill. And I thought nothing of that. I mean, I was an IT guy, but that seed slowly sort of took root, I guess. And I think 2 years later, the Legislative Council elections came around. I'd managed to get to speak to most of the MHKs by then. And I put my application in, and I was fortunate to receive sufficient votes to be elected back in March 2020.
And I guess the last 5 years has flown by. What are the sorts of things that you've been involved with? What have you influenced? I suppose the obvious question: what has Rob Mercer done that anyone else wouldn't have done?
Well, I can't really speak for what other people might have done, but initially I said that I would not work in a department, for example, because I felt that there was perhaps a conflict there between the role of scrutiny and being in a department. But I did at the hustings mention that there are lots of other parts of being a member of Tynwald. So the committee systems, which is of course the scrutiny committees, very important part of governance and oversight. And I was fortunate to be elected onto the Environment and Infrastructure Committee, first as a member, and then subsequently through various changes of membership of that, I'm currently the chair of that scrutiny committee. So that's been that particular committee, the Environment and Infrastructure, looks at the current policies and strategies of the Department of Environment, Food and Agriculture and Department of Infrastructure.
And what, because I think some people maybe misunderstand the role of the committee is purely about scrutiny. You don't offer policy alternatives, or do you?
No, we might make suggestions where there is a gap in policy as part of that scrutiny role. So I think the initial ones, the initial reports when I was a member of that committee, we looked at the operation of the meat plant, and actually a couple of reports came out of that. Also, in terms of, I think there was also a report on the milk side, and that was a more of a public safety angle. And of course, the findings of those reports have been incorporated into current thinking. So I suppose part of it is you're looking at what are the current policies, how are they operating in practice, how are they delivering benefit or improved service to the public. And if you can identify where there are gaps or areas that can be improved, you can conclude that in a report, and on the back of that conclusion you can bring a recommendation to Tynwald. At that point it's a debate in Tynwald, and those recommendations that forms the basis of the debate, the report itself and the recommendations you're making. Those recommendations can be amended, and often are amended and debated, and so new policy is formed sometimes on the basis of those reports that those scrutiny committees produce.
Is the role of an MLC significantly different to the role of an MHK?
Well, I'm not an MHK, so I don't. Clearly, I don't have the same constituency workload that an MHK has. Although members of the public do contact us, particularly when bills are going through legislative process, and they feel that it's something that affects them, or they've got concerns. So our inbox fills up at certain times when certain bits of legislation are coming through.
But I suppose that I should have been more specific in relation to policy. Do you have similar roles, or do you think the roles are different?
No, I think the roles are different. I mean, policy is, and quite rightly, is formed, I think, or should be formed in Keys. They're the elected members. They're the people who are elected directly by their constituents. I think the role of the MLC, subsequent to that, is to look at those emerging policies with a scrutiny lens and look and say, are there any gaps? How can this be refined? It's a refining thing rather than necessarily the production of new policy.
Peter Greenhill was on a few weeks ago, and he described his role, because it is fair to say that he's probably been the least visible of the MLCs during his time. He felt his role was more about having quiet words with MHKs and suggesting that perhaps a different course of action might be a sensible one, or recommending different ideas. Is that the role, or effectively you're taking the money, not quite the same as an MHK, but it's still a substantial salary that you get? Should you not be a bit more vocal and be obviously earning your money?
Well, it's not as public a role, that's for sure. And I'm sure there's definitely aspects of, we work in the same building. And so, of course, there is always going to be opportunity where you can discuss, an idea or ideas or policy or legislation going through with people. But really, if there is a point to Tynwald and to Keys and Legislative Council, is to put those things on the record, so that the thinking behind these things is itself subject to scrutiny. I think that's really important.
And do you think sometimes members miss that? They think, well, I've done all the thinking. I know why I'm voting in a particular way. I don't need to tell everybody this.
I suppose I can only use myself as an example. If I'm to vote against something, I think it's incumbent on me to stand up and to say I'm not voting for this because these are the reasons behind it. the caveat to that is, if several of the people have already stood up and made exactly those same points, you're not really adding anything new to that public record. So, not always, but I think it's probably good practice to explain yourself and actually to be accountable afterwards.
The other side of things, and this is from my experience, it was always an awful lot easier to think of the reasons why something wasn't as good as it might be. And as a result, you tended to focus on those things. Do you think sometimes Tynwald misses a trick in terms of explaining why they're actually voting for things, why things that may be seen in the public eye as less ideal, actually explaining, well, actually, I'm going to vote for this, and I'm voting for this not because I'm a government patsy, but because I think this makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I have stood and in debate and supported something, but it's possible to support something and still point out the limitations of it. And there's been quite a few examples of that, really. I think where we had the economic strategy, and there's part of that where they're doing investment into private development to kickstart that side of things. And the construction sector is a very important sector of the economy. But at the same time, you have the affordable housing issue, and I felt that I can support the overall the overall thrust of the strategy, but I should point out that actually there's a mismatch between what's actually happening and what the problem is. And so I think it's important that we're able to add our voice to those debates in Tynwald. Whether that results in any change in policy or strategy, it's just down to how the vote goes ultimately.
Many people listening to the programme, I guess, will understand how an IT consultant or expert can deliberate with some level of authority on IT-related stuff. You were saying you were working for the finance industry, so you could talk about those sorts of things. Perhaps it's more difficult for people to understand how the skills that you might have can then be used across the whole breadth of policy and finance and legislation that you are involved with making decisions on. How does that work? How do your specific skills help you in fulfilling your role?
Yeah, I mean, it's impossible to be an expert on every subject. But I suppose some of the transferable skills are within the sort of the previous IT role. Is quite often you do what's called a gap analysis. Here is something that people want delivered. Here is what we've got, and then what are the steps that we've already got in place that's going to move us towards that, and what's the bits that are missing. That's a really useful process, really useful and transferable skill if you're looking at a strategy or a policy or even a piece of legislation. The syntax is different to computing, but there are a lot of similarities, which has been really helpful.
Do you think that Tynwald, and indeed government, I suppose more government than Tynwald, does enough of that kind of gap analysis?
I think so. I mean, the policy officers that I've met and worked with have done exactly that. They when I suppose there's a link here, isn't there? Is that you've got the island plan, you've got the economic strategy, and they're identifying the sort of, this is what we want to achieve. And then the legislative and policy officers behind that are looking at that and say, well, okay, in order to achieve that, we're going to need to change some legislation. We're going to need to ensure that there's policies that support that part of the island plan that needs to be delivered. I think generally speaking, I think it's my experience anyway has been that's a good process. I'm not sure that is always visible publicly.
It is part of the reason I suspect that LegCo elections stagger Keys elections is so that there will be some level of continuity of experience between general elections. As a member of LegCo, effectively you have not faced an election since the Howard Quayle administration.
Yeah, that's right.
How does that change between administrations? How does that work? I mean, is it do you as an MLC see significant change between one administration and another? Do you see your role as helping ensure that the jump between one administration and another is less severe than perhaps it might have been?
I mean, there might be an element of that. I think, though, if you look at the number of Keys members who are returned each time, I think there is still there's some element already of that corporate memory at Keys level, and it's really important that happens, I think. But I think there is also that, from the Legislative Council point of view, that sort of 2-year overlap is quite useful, because it means that for someone new coming into the role in LegCo, there are people who are a couple of years at least ahead of you who can help you to understand, the nuts and bolts really of ensuring you become as effective as you can as quickly as you can. I think that's really useful.
And we often hear politicians, particularly Keys members, saying, "Oh well, this is my first term, so I need 5 years' experience before I can really make much of a difference." Perhaps not recognising that after 5 years they may no longer be a member of the House of Keys. How long do you think it took you to get the experience that you needed to be fully functional and effective?
Well, of course, almost immediately after being elected, we were straight into COVID. And so that was a really, really difficult time for everybody, for the population, for everyone trying to get things done. And we almost immediately shifted to remote working. So that chance to interact with other members was a bit less obvious. And also the amount and the pace of legislative change. We were having sittings twice a week. We'd have a Tynwald sitting, then we'd be having a Legislative Council sitting. And so actually, in terms of getting to grips with the scrutiny of legislation, that happened quite quickly, because I had to get used to it quickly because of the rapid pace of the changes that were being put in front of us. So that part was useful. But I felt really it was only once we returned to normal time, shall we say, that then the knowledge of the process broadens out at that point. So I think probably 6 to 9 months in, you start to think, okay, yeah, I understand this to the right degree now, and I can begin to be really effective.
And we're often told that the main function of Legislative Council is to scrutinise legislation, although you do in Tynwald, obviously you vote on policy, you vote on finance. But in terms of legislation, in terms of a bill that's presented to you, what are the processes that you go through, and what is it specifically you would say you're looking for when you look at a bill for the first time? Okay. So normally I would start with, well, what's the principles behind this bill? What's its purpose? Where's the underlying policy or strategy? What's the pillars of this thing? And once you understand that, then you can start to look at the details of the bill, and to understand how each of those clauses interact with each other and also deliver that policy or deliver that strategy. So that's the sort of the broad brush, big picture part of it, I guess, is then looking at each
individual clause, there's the technical scrutiny. It says, do these cross-references match up to these other things that it's referring to? In some cases, it's other acts or other strategies or policies. And then finally, there's the clause by clause, where we go through and we say, okay, here's the original intent. How does this deliver that intent? And is the wording of that going to work? Actually, there's another part of it, and that is, it's the gaps. Is there anything missing from this bill as it's been amended by Keys? Then it comes to us in Legislative Council. So we also look and listen to the debate that's been had in Keys, where, the pros and cons of a particular clause or the thrust of a particular direction has been discussed in detail. The ones that are, I suppose, deserve greater scrutiny are those ones where there's been a bit of opposition on a particular clause, and particularly if it's very tight. Was the evidence behind that, good evidence? Was it sufficient to come down one side or another? And so at that point, we can take those things and say, well, can we refine this clause any further? And that's where amendments to bills in Legislative Council are put to Legislative Council and debated. Usefully, then they go back to Keys, and Keys decide whether or not to keep the amendments we've made. And we do have to justify why we've made an amendment. We do that in Legislative Council in debate. But ultimately, it's for the Keys, the elected members, to decide whether they want our refinements or not.
And then I suppose the obvious question, you've been in 5 years, that you will no doubt over that 5-year period have identified gaps and identified solutions. What are the highlights, would you say, of the things that you've done? Are there any particular gaps that you've filled and you've thought, yes, that's something that I've managed to achieve here that's quite special?
I would say that it doesn't feel like it's a role where you just have one big achievement or two big achievements. It feels more of a continuous process. So I wouldn't really single out any one. Other than to say it's nice when you spot something, if there's been a cross-reference missed, that means there's a consequential amendment to another piece of legislation. That's a really important one to have captured at that point, because it means it doesn't have to be revisited in a few years' time when we realise actually, how did we all miss that? So they're quite satisfying, but for me it feels more of a continuous process. A continuous process of refinement rather than any big, shouty hurrah.
Are you going to stick with your view that you shouldn't be in a department if you're successfully elected?
No, I did change my mind on that.
Right.
I was asked by numerous ministers to join departments, and I did stick to my guns initially. And then I was asked by Jane Poole Wilson to join her at DHA, and Jane's very persuasive. And I said, well, okay, but I want to just concentrate on the legislative side rather than the policy. And on that, I still have an input in terms of policy, but I am one member of LegCo. There's two members of Keys developing that policy, so I was comfortable with that balance. I felt that was the right balance. And
were you wrong to take your initial decision, or were you wrong to change that decision?
Gosh, yes, that's a nice question. No, I think my understanding of it changed, and so when the facts changed, I changed my opinion.
And I think, well, I don't know. You tell me. That there are times where you can have a pretty strong and fundamental view on an issue, and then you are presented with a whole load of different bits of evidence, perhaps things that you hadn't considered before. And it is okay for politicians to change their mind, isn't it?
It is. It is okay. It's good to have strong opinions, but if the evidence is pointing the other way, then it's not worth. You shouldn't necessarily hold on to it just for dogmatic reasons. I think evidence-based policy rather than policy-based evidence.
What are the good reasons why Rob Mercer should continue to be an MLC for the next 5 years?
Well, I've got a good understanding of both public and private sector. I've run my own business. I've got an understanding of the challenges of that. I've got a good grasp of business economy, but also the importance of social justice. And ultimately, we are here to look after the people of the Isle of Man, and to deliver services as best we can, and to deliver legislation that benefits them. I've got drive, I've got determination, I would be delighted if I were returned, and it's now down to whether I can garner enough votes from the MHKs.
That was MLC Rob Mercer. Over the next few weeks, we hope to hear from all the LegCo candidates so you can make your own mind up on their merit. If you are standing, get in touch with Phil Gorn at manxradio.com so we can arrange an interview. Let me know your thoughts on the programme and get in touch if you have any ideas for future shows. Don't forget, this programme is available as a podcast on Manx Radio's website. For now, though, I'm Phil Gorn. Go to Mayo. Thanks for listening.